The rope was a coarse and hateful thing in his hands. Eli Granger had tied many knots in his 60 years. Knots to bind the timbers of the house he built with Clara. Knots to secure the harnesses on his mules. He even tied the final, delicate knot on the swaddling clothes of 2 sons who never drew a breath. But this knot was different. This one was an ending. He stood on a wobbly stool in the dusty center of his barn, the air thick with the smell of old hay and finality. The noose dangled from the highest rafter, a perfect waiting circle. He didn't cry. The tears had dried up weeks ago, right around the time the dirt settled over Clara's grave. He hadn't spoken a word in 4 days, not since he'd offered a prayer so quiet even God might have missed it. His life was a series of ghosts now. The echo of Clara's laughter in the empty kitchen, the scent of her on the pillow beside him, the half-finished quilt still draped over a chair, its pattern unfinished, just like their life together. There was nothing left to hold on to, nothing but the coarse rope and the long drop. He raised his hands, reaching for the noose, ready to fit it over his head and step off the edge of the world. And that's when he heard it. It wasn't the wind whistling through the cracks in the barn wood. It wasn't a rat skittering in the shadows. It was a whimper, a tiny human sound, so faint he almost dismissed it as a trick of his grieving mind. He froze, his hands hovering in the air. Silence returned. He shook his head, thinking it was just the loneliness playing tricks. He was about to continue, to finish the job, when it came again. A soft, muffled cough, immediately followed by a frantic, whispered, "Shh." The sound came from the far corner of the barn, from behind a mountain of hay bales he hadn't touched since last winter. Every instinct honed from a life on the frontier screamed at him. No sane person hides in another man's barn. You were either a thief, or you were hiding from something far worse than one. For the first time in months, a feeling other than grief surged through him. It wasn't fear, it was something sharper, something alive. His hands dropped from the noose. He stepped down from the stool, his boots making no sound on the straw-covered floor. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, his eyes locked on the corner. He pulled his pitchfork from where it was stabbed into a wooden post. It wasn't for attack, it was for answers. He reached the hay bales, his heart thudding a hard, steady rhythm against his ribs. He didn't call out. He didn't give a warning. He simply used the handle of the pitchfork to nudge the top bale aside. And then he saw them. Crumpled together in the dark hollow was a family. A woman and 5 children, huddled together like frightened rabbits. They were filthy, their clothes little more than rags, and their eyes were wide with a terror so profound it stole his breath. The woman held the youngest, a little girl maybe 3 years old, protectively in her lap. 2 small boys, who couldn't be older than 10, flanked her, and beside them, 2 older girls, maybe 11 or 12, pressed themselves against the rough barn wall. They were all as thin as fence posts, their faces pale and smudged with dirt. The eldest girl had a fresh cut on her lip. The youngest boy was clutching a worn wooden spoon as if it were a sword. The woman looked up at him, her face a mask of desperation. Her lips trembled as she spoke, her voice a raw, cracked whisper. "Please," she begged, "please don't make us leave." Eli just stood there, the pitchfork feeling heavy and useless in his hand. He stared at them, at the landscape of fear on their faces. The woman seemed to think he hadn't heard. "We thought this place was abandoned," she said, her voice shaking. "I swear it. We didn't know anyone lived here." Eli slowly, carefully, lowered the pitchfork. He didn't speak. He couldn't. His voice was a rusty tool he hadn't used in days. He just looked, his gaze drifting from the girl's split lip to the boy's raw knuckles, to the hollows in their cheeks. He could see the faint outline of their ribs through their tattered shirts. Finally, he found his voice. It came out as a low rasp, a sound like stones grinding together. "You hungry?" The woman's eyes instantly filled with tears. She didn't weep, but the tears spilled over and traced clean paths through the grime on her face. She nodded once, a sharp, desperate movement. Beside her, all 5 children nodded in unison, their eyes fixed on him, wide and waiting. He didn't need to say another word. He stepped back and gestured with his head toward the house. They followed him like a line of ghosts, their bare feet shuffling silently in the dirt. Inside the small cabin, Eli moved as if in a trance. He stoked the cold embers in the wood stove, adding kindling until a small flame licked to life. He opened the pantry, the shelves mostly bare except for a few jars of beans and some hardtack. He cracked open a large jar and dumped the contents into a pot. The family huddled near the growing warmth of the stove, not speaking, barely moving. They watched him with an unnerving stillness. The mother, in particular, kept glancing toward the door, as if expecting a demon to burst through it at any moment. As the smell of food began to fill the small room, life seemed to seep back into them. The smallest girl, the one who'd been in her mother's lap, finally let go of her mother's dress. Eli turned from the stove. "What's your name?" he asked the woman. "Ruth," she said, her voice still quiet but a little stronger now. "Ruth Tallow. These are my children. Joseph, Ruthie, Mabel, Enoch, and the little one is Clara." Eli's breath hitched at the last name. His Clara. He said nothing, just turned back to the pot and stirred the beans. He couldn't look at them. Not for a moment. He had almost left this world, and now the ghost of his wife's name was sitting by his fire. He had to know. "You runnin' from someone?" he asked, keeping his voice even. Ruth hesitated. The silence stretched out, filled only by the crackle of the fire and the bubbling of the beans. "Yes," she finally said. Eli waited. He knew the look of a person running. He'd seen it in the war. He'd seen it in men who'd jumped their claims. It was a look that hollowed you out from the inside. "My husband," she began, and her story came tumbling out. "He passed a year ago. We were with a wagon company heading west to find land, but he took a fever, just outside a place called Black Hollow. It took him fast." Eli glanced at her. Her face was etched with exhaustion, but there was a fierce strength in her eyes. He could see it now. This woman was a fighter. "After he was buried," she continued, her gaze dropping to the floor, "the wagon master, he said we were a burden. Too many mouths, not enough hands. Said the children were too loud. He told us we had to leave." She looked up, her eyes pleading with him to believe her. "I tried to keep them quiet. I really did. But they're children. They left us, just kicked us out of the wagon, left us with nothing but a sack of flour and the clothes on our backs." Eli listened, his expression unreadable. It was a hard story, but the West was full of hard stories. "We've been moving ever since," Ruth finished, her voice barely a whisper. "Sleeping in barns, sheds, anywhere we could find shelter, just trying to get somewhere safe." The fire crackled, popping loudly in the quiet room. Eli took the pot off the stove and ladled the warm beans into 5 chipped bowls. He handed the first one to the eldest girl, Mabel. She took it with trembling hands, and as she brought the first spoonful to her lips, tears streamed down her face. She didn't make a sound, just ate and cried. Eli cleared his throat, the sound loud in the tense air. "I'm Eli Granger." All of them looked up, their eyes fixed on him. "This is my house," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "That was my barn. My wife is gone, and I had no plans for tomorrow." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "But I reckon I do now." Ruth stared at him, her mouth slightly agape, as if she couldn't comprehend what he was saying. "You can stay," Eli said plainly. "There's work that needs doing. Chores I can't keep up with alone anymore. I need hands. You need a roof and food." You don't even know us," Ruth stammered. "Don't need to," he said, his gaze firm. "You're here. That's enough for now." For a long moment, there was only silence. It was a heavy, fragile thing, filled with unspoken questions and fears. Then the smallest girl, little Clara, let out a sudden, bright laugh. It was a sound so full of pure, childish joy that it seemed to physically push back the grief that had settled in the corners of Eli's home. The air shifted. The heavy shroud of sorrow seemed to thin, like sunlight breaking through thick cobwebs. That night, Ruth and her children slept on blankets on the floor near the stove, exhausted and finally safe. Eli didn't sleep at all. He sat in his old rocking chair, the one Clara had loved, and watched the embers in the stove die down to a soft orange glow. He listened to the quiet breathing of the 5 children, a sound that had been absent from his house for so long. He thought about the noose still hanging in the barn like a silent, waiting ghost. He had been so close to stepping into the emptiness. And then, a whimper in the hay had pulled him back. It didn't make a lick of sense. Was this a second chance? Or was it just a different kind of ending? He didn't have an answer. But as the first hints of dawn touched the sky, he knew one thing for sure. He had a reason to see the sun come up tomorrow. He just had no idea what that sun would reveal. The next morning, the promise of a new beginning felt real. The air was crisp, and for the first time in a long time, Eli didn't wake up with a crushing weight on his chest. He felt a purpose. He stepped outside, axe in hand, ready to chop wood for a fire that would warm more than just himself. And that's when he saw them. Tracks, in the soft dirt of his yard. They weren't his. They weren't from the bare feet of Ruth's children. These were boot prints, big ones, deep-set and heavy, made by men who walked with confidence, with authority. And there was more than one set. His gut twisted into a cold knot. The tracks led from the edge of the woods, straight to his barn. They stopped right at the door, milled around for a moment, and then turned back, disappearing into the thickets near the creek. Eli crouched, running his calloused fingers over the edge of one print. The impression was sharp and clear. These were fresh, made sometime in the night. Whoever was here, they hadn't been just passing through. They had been looking for something, or someone. He counted at least 4 different sets of prints. One was heavier than the others, the stride long and wide. The man who made that track was big, and probably on horseback for most of the journey. The others were smaller, but still men's boots. Not trappers, not travelers. These were the tracks of men on a hunt. He stood up slowly, dusting the dirt from his hands, his eyes scanning the quiet, sun-drenched hills. The world looked exactly the same as it had yesterday. The trees swayed in the gentle breeze. A hawk circled high overhead. But everything had changed. The peace was gone, replaced by a low, humming tension, the kind that comes right before a storm breaks. He walked back to the house, his steps heavy. Inside, the cabin was filled with a quiet bustle. Ruth was humming softly as she swept the floor. Mabel and Ruthie were carefully hauling a bucket of water from the pump, their faces screwed up with concentration. The boys, Joseph and Enoch, were trying to fix a loose board on the porch. They were trying to build a life from the splinters of their old one. Eli watched them for a long moment, and a feeling, sharp and fiercely protective, tightened in his chest. This wasn't pity anymore. It was something else entirely. Ruth looked up from her sweeping and saw the expression on his face. She immediately went still, the broom frozen in her hands. "What is it?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. She stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "Someone was here last night," he said, his voice low. "Left tracks all around the barn." Before he even finished the sentence, the color drained from Ruth's face. She instinctively pulled little Clara, who was playing by the hearth, closer to her side. "They found us," she breathed, the words laced with a chilling certainty. "Who?" Eli demanded. "Who is looking for you, Ruth? The truth this time." She swallowed hard, her knuckles white as she gripped Clara's shoulder. She looked at her children, then back at Eli, her eyes filled with a terror he now understood was not just about being hungry or homeless. This was something far darker. "Kern Madden," she whispered, the name tasting like poison on her lips. Eli waited, The name meant nothing to him. "My husband, the one who died," she started, her voice trembling. "He owed Kern money, a lot of it. Back in Missouri, Kern fronted us the wagon, the tools, the seed for the journey. Said we could pay him back once we settled our claim out west." Her eyes darted to the door again. "But when my husband died, Kern said the debt didn't die with him. He said I had to work it off. That we all had to work it off." Her voice broke, and she looked toward her eldest daughters. "He meant the girls, too." Eli's jaw clenched so hard, a muscle jumped in his cheek. He looked at Ruthie, a little girl no older than 10, with wide, innocent eyes. The thought of a man like that laying a hand on her sent a hot, white rage through him. "I ran," Ruth said, her voice barely audible. "I ran the night he came to our tent, the night he tried to take Mabel." "Did he follow you?" Eli asked, his voice flat and hard as iron. "All this way from Missouri?" Ruth nodded miserably. "I thought we'd lost him weeks ago. We doubled back, hit our tracks, traveled at night. But I should have known. He's not a man who gives up on something he thinks he owns." Eli looked past her, toward the barn where the noose he'd forgotten about still hung. He had been ready to give up on everything. Now, a fight had come looking for him. He strode out of the house without another word. He went straight to the barn, climbed the rafters, and took the rope down. He coiled it neatly, wrapped it in an old piece of burlap, and tucked it deep inside his woodshed, burying it under a pile of logs. He was burying his own ghost. When he returned to the house, he looked at Ruth, his eyes clear and resolute. "They won't take you," he said. It wasn't a promise. It was a statement of fact. "They won't take any of you." "You don't know him, Eli?" she whispered, her face pale with fear. "He's a monster." "No," Eli said, his voice cold and steady. "But he doesn't know me, either." The ride into Claremont was dusty and hot. Eli hadn't been to town in months, not since Clara's passing. He'd avoided the pitying looks, the quiet whispers, but today was different. He wasn't running from ghosts anymore. He was hunting them. Claremont wasn't much to look at. A single dusty street with a general store, a saloon, a post office, and the sheriff's office. Eli tied his mule to the hitching post and walked straight into the one place he figured might have answers. Sheriff Clay Booker was a heavy-set man with a kind face and tired eyes. He looked up from his paperwork, a pipe clenched in his teeth, and his eyebrows shot up in surprise. "Granger," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Well, I'll be. Ain't seen you in a coon's age. Everything all right out at your place?" "Depends," Eli said, getting straight to the point. "I need to know if you've seen any strangers ride through in the last couple of days. 4, maybe 5 men, looking rough. Might be asking about a woman and some children." Sheriff Booker leaned forward, taking the pipe from his mouth. His expression turned serious. The lazy afternoon air in the office suddenly felt heavy. "As a matter of fact, we did," he said slowly. "A group came through yesterday afternoon. Loud bunch. Stirred up some trouble down at the saloon. Said they were tracking a runaway." Eli's face remained a stony mask. "A runaway what?" "Claimed she was their indentured servant," the sheriff said, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he hadn't quite believed the story himself. "Said she stole a horse and a month's worth of provisions." It didn't match Ruth's story. Not exactly, but it was close enough to make the hair on Eli's arms stand up. "They give a name?" Eli asked. "The one doing all the talking," the sheriff recalled, tapping his pipe on the edge of his desk. "Said his name was Kern, big fella. Had a nasty scar on his cheek and a mouth that looked like it had never smiled a day in its life. The kind of man you don't turn your back on." "That's him," Eli muttered, more to himself than to the sheriff. "You know this fella, Eli?" "Don't need to," Eli said, turning to leave. "Hold on, Granger," the sheriff called after him. "They're still in the area. Camped out for the night up past the North Ridge. Said they were going to make one more sweep of the valley this morning before heading east. If you think this woman they're looking for is out on your land, you got to be careful. This Kern fella, he's got bad blood in him. I can feel it." Eli just nodded once and walked out, leaving the sheriff staring after him. He didn't ride his mule hard on the way back, but his mind was racing. Servant? Stolen goods? Ruth hadn't mentioned any of that. Was she lying? Or was Kern Madden twisting the story to get the law on his side? It didn't matter. He'd seen the fear in those children's eyes. He'd seen the split lip on the girl's face. That was the only truth he needed. When he got back to the homestead, the sun was beginning to dip below the hills, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red. The smell of biscuits and stew hung in the air. For a fleeting moment, it felt like home again, like the old days. He stepped inside and locked the door behind him, the heavy bolt sliding home with a loud thud. Ruth turned from the stove, her face anxious. The children at the small wooden table fell silent. "They're here," Eli said, his voice grim. "In the valley." Ruth went so pale he thought she might faint. "They're not on the property," he clarified, "but they're close, camped out past the ridge. The sheriff figures they'll make their move tomorrow if they don't find you tonight." She stepped toward him, her hands twisting in her apron. "What are we going to do? Should we run?" "No," Eli said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "You've run long enough. This is where it ends." He looked past her, at the two boys, Joseph and Enoch, who were watching him with wide, frightened eyes. "Joseph," Eli said, his gaze locking with the older boys. "You ever fired a rifle?" Joseph's eyes widened even further, but he shook his head no. "Well," Eli said, a grim determination settling over him, "today's a good day to learn." That night, after the children were asleep, Eli didn't rest. He returned to the barn, but not for a noose. He worked under the dim light of a single lantern, his hands moving with a long-forgotten purpose. He was no longer just a farmer. He was a soldier again. He dragged old fence posts from the shed and sharpened their ends into wicked-looking spikes, burying them just beneath the dirt along the back wall of the barn. He boarded up the lower windows of the house, leaving only small slits to see through. He dug shallow pits along the path from the north ridge and covered them with brush. And when he was done with all that, he climbed onto the roof of his small cabin. He lay flat on the shingles, an old, heavy rifle cradled in his arms. It was a rifle he hadn't fired since his days in the 5th Cavalry, but its weight felt familiar and comforting in his hands. He lay there for hours, watching the dark, silent hills. He was a sentinel, a guardian. Just after midnight he saw it. Far off in the distance, toward the ridge, a light flickered, then another, and another. 4 lanterns, swaying in the darkness, moving slowly but steadily. They were coming. He didn't wake Ruth or the children. Not yet. He just lay there on the roof, the cold night air on his face, the rifle heavy in his hands, and waited. The fight was coming to his door, and he would be there to meet it. He was a man with nothing left to lose, or so he thought. He glanced back at the quiet, sleeping house and realized with a jolt that he was wrong. He had everything to lose, all over again. The sun rose red and angry over the hills, casting long, ominous shadows across the yard. The sound came with it, the unmistakable thud of hooves on hard-packed earth. Ruth heard it first. She was at the stove, her hands moving with nervous energy, when she suddenly froze. The ladle she was holding slipped from her fingers and clattered into the pot of simmering porridge. The sound was like a gunshot in the tense silence. "They're here," she whispered, her voice trembling. Eli was already at the window, the old cavalry rifle slung over his back. He'd been awake all night, watching, waiting. He gave her a single, hard look. "Get the children away from the windows, now!" He didn't wait for a reply. He unbolted the heavy door and stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door shut behind him. He would meet this storm head-on. He wouldn't let it touch his house. 4 riders were approaching the edge of his property. They stopped just beyond his fence line, a clear challenge. The man in front dismounted. He was just as the sheriff had described. Tall, lean, with a jagged scar that pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. His eyes were like chips of ice. This was Kern Madden. Behind him, 3 other men sat on their horses, their hands resting casually on the guns at their hips. They looked bored, like this was just another Tuesday. "Mornin'," Kern called out, his voice smooth and oily. "Not for you," Eli replied, his voice flat. He stood his ground on the porch, his hands empty, his posture relaxed. He wanted them to underestimate him. Kern's sneer widened into something that was meant to be a grin. "Now don't get ahead of yourself, friend. I ain't looking for a fight. I just came for what's mine." "There's nothing here that belongs to you," Eli said, his voice calm, but with an undercurrent of steel. "Is that a fact?" Kern said, taking a step forward. "See, I had a servant, a woman named Ruth Tallow. Ungrateful thing. She ran off, stole a horse, provisions, left me in a real bind. I figure that makes her my property and my problem. And I heard she might have passed this way." The story was a lie, a twisted version of the truth designed to sound plausible. Eli knew it, but he played along. "She's not your property," Eli said, his eyes never leaving Kern's. "And she didn't steal anything but her own life back." Kern's eyes narrowed, the friendly facade dropped, revealing the ugliness beneath. "So you're harboring a thief, old man? Is that it?" "You take one more step onto my land," Eli said, his voice dropping low, "and the only thing I'll be harboring is a shovel to bury you with." Kern let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a nasty, grating sound. "You talk awful big for a broken-down old farmer who couldn't even keep his own wife alive." The words hit Eli like a physical blow, but his face didn't change. He had expected cruelty. He was ready for it. "You think I'm broken?" Eli said, a cold, dangerous light entering his eyes. "Son, you haven't seen what a man looks like when he's got nothing left to lose." For a long moment, there was silence. The wind kicked up dust between them. Kern stared at Eli, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. He had expected a scared old farmer. He had not expected this. Finally, Kern spat on the ground and turned back to his horse. "You've got till sundown," he yelled over his shoulder as he swung into the saddle. "Get her and the brats ready. After that, we ain't coming back to talk." Eli stood motionless, watching them ride away, their dark shapes disappearing back into the hills. His heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He had bought them a few hours, but sundown was coming. He turned and went back inside. Ruth was standing by the door, her face a mess of terror and hope. The children were huddled behind her. "What did he say?" she whispered. "Sundown," Eli answered grimly. "That's how long we have." Her eyes darted toward her children, toward the meager belongings she had. Should we run again?" "No," Eli said, his voice hard as granite. He looked at her, at the 5 scared faces behind her, and he felt a wave of cold resolve wash over him. "You ran long enough." He turned to the oldest boy, Joseph. "Enoch, come with me. The lesson I promised you, class is about to start." But this was bigger than just a lesson with a rifle. Eli knew it. Kern wasn't a man who made idle threats. He wouldn't come back to talk. He would come back to take. Eli led the boys behind the barn, out of sight of the house. The sun was already climbing, baking the dry soil. He handed Joseph the smaller of his 2 rifles, an old lever action that was lighter, but still shot straight. "This is not a toy," Eli said, his voice stern. "You don't point it at anything you're not willing to destroy. You understand?" Joseph, his face pale but his eyes determined, nodded solemnly. "I don't want you to shoot anyone," Eli continued, looking from Joseph to Enoch, who he'd given a heavy slingshot and a pocket full of smooth, heavy stones. "Your job is not to fight. Your job is to make noise, to distract them, to slow them down. I'll do the rest. You fire at the ground, at the trees, anywhere but at them. Am I clear?" Both boys nodded. Ruth had protested, her voice laced with fear. "They're just children, Eli." "And he's a man who wants to enslave them," Eli had shot back. "They need to know how to defend themselves. This world doesn't care if they're children." She had fallen silent after that, her face grim. She knew he was right. While the boys practiced loading, aiming, and firing the slingshot at an old tin can, Eli prepared for war. He didn't think for a second that Kern would come knocking on the front door. Men like him were cowards. They were scavengers who crept in through the dark, who looked for weak spots, for unlocked windows. He spent the afternoon reinforcing his defenses. He double-checked the spikes by the barn. He rigged a heavy log to swing down across the main path if a rope was cut. He placed buckets of ash and lye mixed with water on the porch, ready to be thrown. It was ugly, brutal work, but survival wasn't pretty. Inside, Ruth and the girls packed what little they owned into feed sacks. Salt, flour, blankets, matches. She moved with a quiet, grim efficiency. She had lived on the run long enough to know how quickly a home could turn into a memory. Just before the sun began its descent, they gathered in the small cabin. The air was thick with unspoken fear. No one was hungry. The stew from the morning sat cold on the stove. Eli paced the small room once, then stopped. "Listen to me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "All of you. If they get past me, you go to the root cellar." He pointed to a trapdoor hidden beneath a rug. "There's a tunnel. It leads out into the woods behind the creek. You run. You don't look back. You follow the creek north to the railroad tracks. You wait at the water tower. You understand?" Ruth nodded, her hand gripping little Clara's so tightly her knuckles were white. "And you, Eli?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her, at the 5 children who were staring at him as if he were their only hope in the world. A grim, sad smile touched his lips. "They won't get past me," he said. The sun touched the horizon, and the world bled into shades of orange and purple. And then the sound came. Not the thunder of hooves this time. It was quieter, more sinister. The slow, deliberate snap of a twig. The rustle of brush being pushed aside. A flock of birds suddenly burst from the trees by the windmill, their wings beating frantically against the evening sky. Joseph, stationed at the window, gripped his rifle tighter. "I see them," he whispered. But before Joseph could say another word, Kern Madden stepped out of the tree line. He wasn't alone. 2 men fanned out on either side of him, and they weren't trying to be quiet anymore. They were smiling. Kern raised a hand in a lazy, mocking wave. "Evening, neighbor!" he called out. "Time's up!" Eli didn't answer. He stepped out onto the porch, his own rifle now in his hands. "I gave you a choice, old man," Kern continued, his voice dripping with false regret as he ambled closer. "A chance to do this the easy way. You sure you want to end your days protecting a thief and her litter?" "She's under my roof," Eli said, his voice echoing in the still evening air. "That makes her my family. You want her, you'll have to come through me." Kern's smile widened. "I was hoping you'd say that." He let out a sharp, high-pitched whistle, and suddenly, 2 more men appeared, emerging from the shadows on the side of the barn. They had flanked him. Smart. Too smart. There were 5 of them. Eli was one man and a boy with a rifle he'd only learned to shoot that afternoon. The odds were not good. "You take one more step," Eli yelled, raising his rifle to his shoulder, "and I'll drop you where you stand." Kern just laughed. But the laugh died in his throat. Because before he could give an order, before his men could even react, Eli's rifle cracked through the twilight silence. The shot was deafening. It didn't hit Kern. It wasn't meant to. The bullet whistled past Kern's ear and slammed into the hat of the man standing just to his left, knocking it clean off his head. The man yelped and scrambled backward, diving behind a water barrel for cover. That was the signal. From the window of the house, a second shot rang out. Joseph. He did exactly as he was told, firing a round into the dirt at the feet of the 2 flankers by the barn. They cursed and ducked for cover. "Boy's got guts, I'll give him that," Kern growled, his face now a mask of fury. Eli didn't give them time to regroup. He stepped off the porch and fired again, the bullet ricocheting off the barrel of a shotgun held by another of Kern's men. The gun clattered to the ground, and the man stared at his stinging hands in disbelief. Last warning, Eli bellowed. Get off my land! For a moment, nobody moved. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then Kern gave a sharp nod. Take him. They didn't charge head-on. They split up, circling the house, trying to find a weak point. This was what Eli had feared. A coordinated attack. One of the men, the one with a coil of rope slung over his shoulder, made a mad dash for the barn. Eli didn't have a clear shot. He did the next best thing. He grabbed the heavy shovel leaning against the porch railing, swung it like a bat, and connected with the running man's side. The man went down with a grunt, the air knocked out of him. But as he fell, another man came charging around the other side of the house. That's when the trap Eli had set sprang. The man's horse let out a piercing scream as it stepped into the covered pit, its leg impaled on the sharpened spikes Eli had buried there. The horse went down, throwing its rider hard against the ground. The man didn't get back up. 2 down, 3 to go. Inside the house, Ruth heard the horses scream and knew she couldn't just hide. She herded the children toward the root cellar trapdoor. Go, she ordered them. Go now! But Joseph shook his head, his knuckles white on his rifle. Not yet, Ma. The fight was getting closer. One of Kern's men, seeing an opening, rushed the porch. But Eli was ready. He kicked over one of the buckets he'd prepared. A wave of ash and corrosive lye water splashed directly into the man's face. He screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound, clawing at his burning eyes as he stumbled blindly backward. And in that moment of chaos, the front door flew open. It was Ruth. She stood there, a small rusted pistol clutched in both of her trembling hands. Get back inside! Eli yelled at her. But she was already firing. The shots were wild, kicking up dust far from any target. They were more noise than threat, but they did the one thing Eli needed. They distracted Kern Madden. Kern, who had been creeping along the side of the house, spun around at the sound of the pistol shots. And that 1 second was all Eli needed. He brought his rifle up, took a steady breath, and squeezed the trigger. The bullet struck Kern square in the thigh. He cried out, a sharp gasp of pain and surprise, and crumpled to the ground. Everything stopped. The remaining men froze. 2 of their own were down and out. A third was screaming, his face a mess, and now their leader was on the ground, bleeding into the dirt. They weren't paid enough for this. They weren't paid enough to die. Pick him up and go, Eli roared, his rifle still aimed steady. Now! They hesitated for only a second. Then, as Kern started cursing and screaming at them to help him, they scrambled into action. One of them grabbed Kern under the arms and dragged him to his feet. Together, they half-carried, half-dragged their wounded leader back toward the hills, disappearing into the growing darkness. They were gone. Silence descended on the yard, broken only by the pained groans of the man with the burned face and the soft whimpering of the lamed horse. Eli slowly lowered his rifle, his chest heaving. Sweat poured down his face. Behind him, Ruth stood on the porch, the empty pistol hanging limply from her hand, her body shaking uncontrollably. It's over, Eli said, his voice raspy. But Ruth just shook her head, her eyes wide with a certainty that chilled him to the bone. No, she whispered. It's not. With him, it's never over. And as Eli looked out over his yard, at the blood soaking into the dust and the splintered fence posts, he knew she was right. They hadn't won a war. They had only survived a single battle. Kern Madden would be back, and when he came, he'd bring hell with him. Then we won't be here when he gets here, Eli said. The decision was made. There was no discussion, no debate. Ruth's words hung in the air, a prophecy of doom. They had to leave. They worked through the night in a silent, frantic rush. Under the cold light of the moon, they packed. Food, water, blankets, the few precious tools Eli owned. Joseph and Enoch, their boyish faces grim and old in the lantern light, tied bundles with surprising efficiency. The girls, their eyes wide and haunted, helped their mother, their small hands folding clothes and stacking biscuits. Eli went to the shed and hitched his old, sturdy mule to the wagon he normally used for hauling lumber. It was small, and it would be a tight fit for 6 people and all their worldly possessions, but it would have to do. As they loaded the last of the feed sacks onto the wagon, Ruth came and stood beside him in the darkness. "You didn't have to do any of this," she said, her voice so quiet he could barely hear it over the chirping of the crickets. "We were strangers. We were nothing to you." Eli stopped what he was doing and looked at her. Her face was smudged with dirt and streaked with tears, but in the moonlight, he could see the fierce, unbreakable spirit in her eyes, the same spirit he'd once loved in his Clara. "You were something," he said simply. "You just didn't know it yet." Before she could reply, a small figure appeared at her side. It was little Clara. Her eyes were red from crying, but she wasn't crying now. She looked up at Eli, her expression serious. She reached out and tugged on the sleeve of his worn shirt. "Can I sit up front?" she asked, her voice a tiny whisper in the vast, dark night. Eli blinked, taken aback. He looked at the small, upturned face, and something in his chest, a place that had been cold and dead for months, seemed to crack open. "Of course," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. He reached down and lifted her easily, setting her on the wooden driver's seat of the wagon. She settled into the seat, her small feet dangling far above the floorboards. She looked around, then looked back at him and gave him a small, shy smile. "Thanks, Daddy," she said. The word hit Eli with the force of a physical blow. Daddy. The world seemed to stop. The crickets went silent. The wind died down. The word hung in the air between them, shimmering and sacred, like a prayer in a quiet church. Ruth froze, her eyes wide. Joseph and the other children, who had been watching, all fell silent. Eli couldn't breathe. He hadn't heard that word in so long. He had been a father once. He had held 2 small, still bundles in his arms and whispered that word into the silence, but it had never been answered. He looked at the little girl sitting on his wagon, her eyes full of innocent trust. He looked at Ruth, whose face was a mixture of shock and something else he couldn't quite read. He looked toward the dark, hostile hills where a wounded monster was nursing his hatred. And in that moment, something shifted inside him. The grief, the anger, the emptiness. It didn't disappear, but it made room. He cleared his throat and gave the little girl a slow, deliberate nod. "Yeah," he said, his voice rough. "All right." It wasn't just a wagon leaving a homestead anymore. It was a family, and he was their father. He didn't know if he was worthy of the title. He didn't know if he could protect them. But as he climbed into the driver's seat beside the little girl who had just renamed him, he knew one thing for sure. He would die trying. As the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon, their wagon was already a dark speck moving across the vast, empty landscape. They were running. But this time, they were running together. The ride was tense and quiet. Every snap of a twig, every shadow that danced across the trail, made them jump. Joseph and Enoch walked alongside the wagon, their eyes constantly scanning the trail behind them, their hands never far from the rifle and the slingshot. In the back of the wagon, Ruth held the youngest children close, whispering reassurances she didn't feel herself. Eli sat at the reins, the little girl Clara occasionally dozing against his side. Her simple, trusting word, "Daddy," echoed in his mind. It was a brand on his soul, a responsibility he hadn't asked for, but now couldn't imagine abandoning. It was heavier than any grief he had ever carried. He pushed them hard, following an old ridge trail that led north, toward a place called Durrett's Pass. It was a treacherous route, a narrow cut through towering sandstone cliffs. It was dangerous, but it was also the fastest way out of Kern Madden's reach. But as they traveled, a nagging thought began to burrow into Eli's mind. Ruth's story. It didn't add up. Kern had called her a servant, said she'd stolen from him. She'd claimed he was a creditor who wanted to enslave her daughters. Why the different stories? People lied to protect themselves, he knew that. but this felt different. There was a piece of the puzzle missing. On the third day, as they rested the mule by a small, hidden spring, he decided he had to know the truth. The whole truth. The children were playing a short distance away, their laughter a fragile sound in the wilderness. He sat down on a rock opposite Ruth. "Ruth," he began, his voice low, "we need to talk." She looked up, her eyes immediately wary. "About what?" "Kern Madden," he said. "When he came to the house, he said you were an indentured servant who stole from him. That's not the story you told me. You told me he was a creditor." Ruth's face went pale. She dropped her gaze, staring at her hands. "He was lying, to make you turn against me." "Maybe," Eli said, his eyes boring into her. "But you weren't telling me the whole truth either, were you?" She didn't answer. The silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. "I'm risking everything for you and these children," Eli said, his voice hard but not unkind. "I've faced down 5 men. I've left my home, everything I had left of my wife. If I'm going to die protecting you, I deserve to know what I'm dying for. I need the real story, Ruth, all of it." Ruth took a deep, shuddering breath. When she looked up at him, her eyes were filled with a fresh wave of tears, but also with a terrible resolve. "You're right," she whispered. "I'm sorry, I was scared. I didn't think you'd help me if you knew." "Knew what?" Eli pressed. She finally met his gaze, and the secret she'd been holding came tumbling out, a confession that changed everything. "Kern Madden isn't his real name," she said, her voice trembling. "It's an alias he uses for his business. His real name is Obadiah Tallow." Eli stared at her, confusion clouding his face. Tallow. That was her last name. "Obadiah Tallow," she repeated, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "He's not a creditor I owe money to, Eli." She paused, taking another shaky breath. "He's my husband." The world tilted on its axis. Eli felt as if the ground had fallen out from under him. Her husband? The man she had told him died of a fever a year ago? "The man in the grave," he started, his mind reeling. "There is no grave," she confessed, tears now streaming freely down her face. "He's not dead. I wish he was, but he's not." Eli was speechless. He felt like a fool. He had taken her in, fought for her, all based on a lie. A massive, world-altering lie. "The fever," she continued, her voice choked with sobs. "It wasn't a real fever. It was a concoction of herbs I made, something to make him sleep. A deep, deep sleep. I just wanted a head start. I told everyone in his camp he had passed. We held a mock funeral. I just needed to get the children away from him." "His camp?" Eli asked, his voice a low growl. "You said you were with a wagon company." "That was another lie," she admitted miserably. "It wasn't a wagon company. It was him, his men. The ones who came to your house. They're not just hired guns. They're his followers, his gang. He deals in stolen goods, sometimes stolen people." The full, monstrous truth was finally laid bare. She hadn't been abandoned by a wagon train. She had escaped from the clutches of a monster she was married to. A man so terrible that she had to fake his death just to get away. Eli stood up and walked away from her, his mind a whirlwind of anger, betrayal, and a strange, grudging understanding. He had been lied to, manipulated. But then he looked over at the children. He saw Mabel braiding Ruthie's hair. He saw Joseph standing guard, his young face a mask of fierce concentration. He saw little Clara, who had called him Daddy. They were not part of the lie. Their fear was real. The bruises he'd seen were real. He turned and walked back to Ruth, who was now openly weeping, her shoulders shaking. "Why?" he asked, his voice softer now. "Why marry a man like that?" "I didn't know," she whispered. "When I met him, he was charming, a respected trader, but after we were married, after Joseph was born, he changed. He became possessive, cruel. The things he did, Eli, the things he made me watch him do." She couldn't finish, her words dissolving into a pained sob. Eli looked at the bruises that were still faintly visible on her arms. He looked at the haunted expression that never quite left her eyes. He had been lied to, yes, but he had not been wrong. "All right," he said, his voice firm. "All right, Ruth." He now knew the truth, and it was infinitely worse than he could have ever imagined. He wasn't just hiding a woman from a creditor. He was standing between a family and the devil himself, and the devil was still hunting them. That night, they didn't light a fire. They camped in the cold shadows of the pass, the towering cliffs looming over them like silent stone giants. Eli knew this was the most dangerous part of the journey. The narrow, winding path was a perfect place for an ambush. He was right. Just after dawn, as he was scouting ahead on foot, he saw them. Fresh boot prints in the red dust. 3 sets. No horses. They were moving quietly, trying to get ahead of the wagon. He raced back and told Ruth his plan. It was risky, but it was their only chance. "I'm going to draw them off," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "I'll take the high trail along the cliff face. You take the wagon and the children straight through the pass. Don't stop for anything. I'll meet you on the other side, at a place called Harper's Crossing." "No, Eli," she protested, her eyes wide with fear. "It's too dangerous. They'll corner you." "That's the point," he said, his expression grim. "Better they corner me than you." He looked at Joseph. "You help your mother. You protect your sisters. You understand?" Joseph nodded, his young face set with a determination far beyond his years. Eli didn't wait for any more arguments. He grabbed his rifle and a canteen of water and disappeared into the rocks, climbing swiftly up the steep embankment. Below, Ruth slapped the reins, and the wagon creaked forward into the narrow mouth of the pass. Up on the high trail, Eli moved quickly. He spotted them within minutes. 2 of Obadiah's men crouched behind a large boulder, waiting for the wagon to come around the bend. Eli waited until the wagon was just out of their sight. Then he let out a loud yell. The 2 men spun around, startled, their guns raised. Eli fired twice, not at them, but at the rock face just above their heads. Rock chips and dust rained down on them. They yelped and started firing blindly in his direction. The chase was on, just as he'd planned. He led them on a grueling run along the narrow, treacherous cliff path. He was faster and more sure-footed, using the terrain to his advantage. He ducked behind rocks, fired off single shots to keep their heads down, and then moved again, drawing them further and further away from the pass below. Down in the canyon, the wagon rumbled on. Ruth gripped the reins, her knuckles white, her eyes fixed on the path ahead. The children were silent, huddled together in the back, listening to the faint sound of gunshots echoing from the cliffs above. They were almost through the narrowest part of the pass when a figure stepped out from behind a massive boulder, blocking their path. It was him. Obadiah Tallow, Kern Madden. He was limping heavily, his thigh wrapped in a blood-soaked bandage, but he held a shotgun in his hands, and the grin on his face was pure evil. "Going somewhere, my love?" he drawled, his voice a low, menacing purr. Ruth pulled back on the reins, the wagon lurching to a stop. Obadiah limped closer, his eyes burning with a possessive fire. "You shouldn't have run, Ruth. You just made it worse for yourself. And for the children." Joseph started to stand up, but Ruth put a firm hand on his shoulder, holding him back. She looked her husband in the eye, her own gaze filled with a mixture of terror and defiance. "You have no right," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "They are not your property." "I have every right," he snapped, his voice turning ugly. "I am your husband. You are mine. They are mine. A piece of paper from a preacher says so." It was then that little Clara, who had been hiding behind Mabel, stood up in the back of the wagon. She looked at the monster who was her father, her small face filled with a righteous fury. "You're a bad man!" she yelled, her voice clear and strong. Obadiah blinked, his grin faltering for a second. "What did you just say to me, girl?" "You hurt Mama!" Clara cried. "You tried to take us! You're a bad, bad man!" Obadiah's face contorted with rage. "You shut your mouth or I'll—" He never finished the sentence. A rifle shot cracked from the cliffs high above. The bullet slammed into the rock just inches from Obadiah's feet, shattering it and spraying him with stone fragments. He staggered back, cursing and shielding his face. "Ruth!" Eli's voice boomed from above, echoing through the canyon. "Take the left fork! Go now!" Ruth didn't hesitate. She whipped the reins and the wagon jolted forward, veering sharply onto a smaller, hidden trail that cut behind the lower cliff face. Obadiah recovered and raised his shotgun to fire, but before he could, Joseph stood up, loaded his slingshot, and fired a heavy stone with all his might. It struck Obadiah's hand, and the shotgun clattered to the ground. At the same moment, Eli came charging down the steep, rocky slope, moving with a speed that defied his age. Obadiah looked up, his eyes wide with shock, just as Eli slammed into him with the force of a runaway train. The two men hit the ground in a tangle of limbs, rolling in the dust, fists flying. Obadiah was bigger and stronger, but he was wounded and furious. Eli was smaller, but he fought with the cold, efficient brutality of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and survived. He fought like a man protecting his family. He landed a hard right to Obadiah's jaw, then a brutal blow to his already wounded leg. Obadiah roared in pain and fury, but he was losing. Finally, he broke. He scrambled to his feet and fled, limping and stumbling into the rocks, leaving his shotgun behind in the dust. Eli didn't chase him. He stood, his chest heaving, blood dripping from a cut on his lip. He watched until Obadiah was gone. Then he turned and limped toward the trail the wagon had taken. He caught up with them at Harper's Crossing, just as the sun was setting. Ruth jumped down from the wagon and ran to him, her eyes searching his battered face. "Eli, are you all right?" "I've been worse," he muttered. Then Clara came running. She didn't stop at his feet this time. She ran straight into his arms and clung to him, burying her face in his chest. He hugged her tight, the fierce, protective love he felt for this child washing away the pain and the exhaustion. "You made it, Daddy," she whispered into his shirt. The word didn't surprise him this time. It didn't ache. It didn't feel like a ghost. It felt like home. He looked over her head at Ruth, and at the other 4 children who were now gathering around him, their faces full of awe and relief. He had faced the devil in a canyon and won. For now. But as he looked back at the pass, at the darkening shadows, he knew this wasn't over. A man like Obadiah Tallow didn't just give up. He would be back. And next time, he wouldn't be alone. Next time, he would bring an army.